Jack Carter had spent his life on the edge of disappointment. A quiet rancher in a small, forgotten town, he knew all too well what it felt like to toil under the sun, dreaming of something better, something beyond the hard soil of his humble farm. Every day, he worked tirelessly, yet the reality was always the same. His dreams of owning a thriving ranch seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. The richest family in town, the Hawthorns, had always been a source of fascination and, for Jack, quiet resentment. Their lives were marked by excess, by luxury. They lived in a world he could never touch. So when the invitation arrived, stamped in gold and sealed with arrogance, Jack was torn. He had no desire to be part of their lavish gatherings, yet something about the invite gnawed at him. Was it pity? Or was it their twisted sense of humor, a joke at his expense? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: Jack was about to step into a world that would change everything. What he didn't expect was the cruel joke the Hawthorns had prepared for him. A broken-down cabin, an old, sickly horse mocking gifts, given with an air of superiority. The family laughed, unaware that their so-called gift would not only ignite Jack's spirit but lead him down a path he could never have imagined. What seemed like a cruel prank would soon unravel into the most unlikely of dreams, one that would make the Hawthorns regret ever underestimating a man they once thought beneath them. Jack had no idea then, standing in the wreckage of his new gift, that this seemingly cursed cabin and unwanted horse were the keys to the life he had always wanted. The mansion loomed in front of Jack like a monument to everything he wasn't. The Hawthorns' estate was as grand as it was cold, with towering columns and manicured gardens that spoke of wealth, privilege, and a life he could never touch. It wasn't the first time he'd been invited to one of their parties, though it had been years since he'd last shown up. That night, the invitation had been too enticing to refuse, or perhaps too curious to ignore. What could they possibly want with someone like him? When he arrived, the house was already filled with laughter, the clink of fine crystal, and the murmur of conversation so shallow it could barely stay afloat. The guests, draped in the finest fabrics money could buy, seemed entirely unaffected by the world outside these walls. But then again, they didn't know the world Jack came from. To them, his flannel shirt and worn boots made him a curiosity, a living example of how the other half lived. He could almost hear the whispering behind his back, the subtle jokes about his station, his lifestyle. But that was all it was, whispers. For once, Jack was determined to let them pass over him like a river. After all, he wasn't there to be anyone's joke. At least, not until they made it his turn. "Well, well, Jack," came the voice of Bradford Hawthorne, the eldest son of the family, a man whose arrogance matched his wealth. His voice dripped with a sweetness Jack knew to be insincere. "We thought we'd give you a little something to remember us by. A gift, if you will." The guests leaned in, intrigued. Jack, unsure of where this was going, forced a tight smile. "I appreciate it, but there's no need for—" "Oh, no. It's already been decided." Bradford waved him off with a smirk, signaling to the staff. With perfect timing, two men emerged from the side entrance, dragging behind them a rickety wooden cart. Jack's heart sank. On the cart was a dismal sight: an old broken-down cabin, its paint peeling like dead skin, the windows shattered, the door barely hanging on its hinges. The roof was sagging, and it looked as if it had been abandoned for years. Beside the cabin stood a mangy horse, its coat thin, its ribs visible under the fur, eyes dull with age and exhaustion. The guests burst into laughter, some in genuine amusement, others hiding behind forced chuckles. Jack could feel the eyes on him, the silent judgment of those who believed he was just a country fool, someone they could toy with. But there was a coldness creeping into his chest, an unfamiliar sense of humiliation that he was determined to keep hidden. "What's the matter, Jack?" Bradford's voice sliced through the air. "You don't look impressed. Thought this might be a little more to your liking. The horse is not much, but I'm sure you'll find it useful. A true rancher's animal, right?" Jack could feel his face burning, the sting of embarrassment mixing with a growing sense of anger. He could hear the laughter echoing in the back of his mind, the mocking whispers that threatened to suffocate him. But in the midst of it, something else surged inside him, an odd flicker of defiance. It wasn't the first time life had dealt him a blow, and if anything, he knew how to make the most of things when they seemed most impossible. With a deep breath, he turned to Bradford, keeping his voice steady, despite the chaos within. "I don't need your pity," Jack said, his words calm but sharp. But thank you nonetheless. I'll take the horse and the cabin. I'll find a way to make them work." The laughter died in the room, and for a brief moment, the guests were silent, unsure of how to react. Bradford's smirk faltered, replaced by something unreadable. He hadn't expected Jack to respond like this. He hadn't expected him to take the gift with such grace, or rather, to act as though it wasn't a joke at all. Jack's decision was met with a few uneasy glances, but he didn't care. He was done being the punchline of someone else's game. Little did he know, this joke, the one they'd thought would break him, was only the beginning of something far more powerful. Jack stared at the dilapidated cabin and the mangy horse, his mind spinning. The guests had long since dispersed, leaving him standing there in the fading evening light. The air was still, thick with the remnants of laughter that echoed in his ears. He could almost feel the hawthorn's amusement seeping into the very ground beneath his boots. A joke. A cruel joke. But as the harsh reality of the situation sank in, something else began to stir inside him, a strange, unsettling sense of resolve. He didn't want their pity, their laughter, or their handouts. What they saw as a joke was, in Jack's eyes, a challenge. A challenge he'd always been prepared for. They thought him weak, but they didn't understand the quiet strength that came from years of working the land, surviving on grit and determination. And this broken-down cabin, this unwanted horse, it wasn't a defeat, it was an opportunity. The horse, a sorry creature with a coat more patchwork than smooth, lowered its head as if it knew the jokes had been made at its expense, too. Jack stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He didn't know much about horses, but he knew what it took to care for something, to nurture it, even when it seemed beyond help. He reached out and ran his hand along the horse's neck, feeling the rough, matted fur beneath his fingers. The horse didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, it lifted its head slightly, its dull eyes meeting Jack's with a look that, oddly enough, seemed to say, "I'm not giving up yet." "All right, old girl," Jack muttered under his breath. "Let's see what we can do for you." He led the horse toward the cabin, his mind already racing with plans. The cabin itself was a mess: broken windows, a roof in desperate need of repair, and the walls were more holes than wood. Yet as Jack stepped inside, something shifted. The interior, though dark and musty, had the skeleton of a home. He could see the potential. With his bare hands and the right materials, he could turn it into something solid. A real home. His home. The cabin wasn't just a gift, it was a blank slate. He had the knowledge to fix it, to build it back to life, even if it meant starting with nothing but a few tools and the sweat on his brow. He could already picture the roaring fire in the fireplace, the creak of floorboards underfoot, the smell of wood and earth, and the sound of the horse grazing just outside. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. The Hawthorns had made the mistake of thinking it was a mockery. What they didn't realize was that Jack had always found beauty in the broken things, the things others discarded or overlooked. The next few days passed in a blur of work. Jack spent every waking hour fixing what he could. He patched up the roof first, using whatever scraps he could find. The windows were next. He salvaged old wooden frames from a nearby barn and created makeshift glass panes using clear plastic. It wasn't the most elegant solution, but it worked. Slowly, the cabin began to resemble something more than a forgotten relic. The horse, too, started to show signs of life. Jack spent hours grooming her, carefully combing out the matted fur and feeding her the best hay he could afford. He named her Hope, because, much like him, she had been thrown away but still had the spark of something greater. Every morning, Jack would walk out into the yard, brush down the horse, and talk to her. In return, she would nuzzle him gently, as if to say, "You're not alone in this." As the days went by, the community began to take notice. They'd heard about the Hawthorns' prank, of course. Everyone had. But they hadn't expected Jack to take it so seriously, to pour his heart into this crumbling gift. Whispers of admiration spread. Some people mocked him, sure those who couldn't understand why he would bother with a place so far gone. But Jack didn't care. He was determined to prove that even the most broken things could be turned into something beautiful. And he was starting to believe it, too. The Hawthorns had thought their joke would break him, but in reality, it had done the opposite. It had reignited something deep inside him, something that had always been there, buried beneath the years of hardship and disappointment. A hunger, a fire, a desire to show the world that he was more than they thought. And in the quiet, sweat-soaked hours of his labor, Jack began to realize that the dream he'd always wanted of owning a ranch, of living a life that mattered, wasn't as far out of reach as he had once believed. The joke wasn't on him, he thought as he wiped the sweat from his brow. No, it was on them. They had no idea what they'd set in motion. Months had passed since Jack's quiet transformation, and the Hawthorns had almost forgotten about their little prank. To them, it had been nothing more than a fleeting amusement, something to laugh about over cocktails and dinner parties. But in the small corners of the town, where the wealthy rarely ventured, word had spread about Jack's work. His cabin had become a topic of conversation, a symbol of his grit and determination. What had once been a joke, a mockery of a rancher's life, was now the talk of the town for all the right reasons. It wasn't until one unseasonably warm afternoon that the Hawthorns decided to pay Jack a visit, curious to see what had become of their gift. Bradford Hawthorne, the eldest son, led the charge, followed by his younger sister, Sarah. They drove up the dusty road in their expensive car, no doubt expecting to see Jack huddled in misery, surrounded by the wreckage of his so-called dream. As they neared the cabin, their faces fell. What had once looked like a derelict shack now stood as a testament to Jack's resilience. The roof had been fixed, the windows replaced, and the front porch had been cleaned and reinforced. The yard, once wild with weeds, was now carefully tended, and the faint scent of freshly cut wood lingered in the air. The horse, Hope, grazed nearby, her coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. She was still no thoroughbred, but her once-worn body had gained muscle and vitality. She moved with a grace that surprised even Jack, who had been certain she'd never be anything more than a shadow of a horse. Bradford's eyes widened as he took in the sight, his mouth slightly agape. Sarah, ever the more composed of the two, looked at Jack with a mixture of disbelief and awe. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Jack to turn their joke into something so real, so undeniable. "You've really done something with it," Bradford said, his voice lower than usual, almost begrudgingly. It was a far cry from the mocking tone he'd used months ago. Jack, leaning against the porch with his arms crossed, regarded them coolly. "I told you I'd make it work." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the realization that the Hawthorns had underestimated him. They had thought their gift would break Jack, but instead it had fueled his fire. What had been a cruel joke had turned into the foundation of a new life, one that was far more meaningful than any of the frivolous luxuries they enjoyed. As the Hawthorns stood there, unable to find the words to take back their mockery, Jack couldn't help but smile. The joke, it seemed, had backfired in the best way possible. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over Jack's ranch. It had been over a year since the Hawthorns' joke, and now the place had been transformed into a thriving, modest homestead. The cabin was fully restored, with sturdy walls and a new roof that stood tall against the elements. The porch had become a peaceful spot where Jack often sat in the evening, watching the world unfold in quiet satisfaction. The once sickly horse, Hope, now trotted around the yard with strength and purpose. Her coat was a rich, healthy brown, and her eyes sparkled with life, just as Jack had known they would. They had become a team, Jack, the humble rancher, and Hope, his loyal companion. Together, they worked the land, tending to animals and managing crops. The small farm was flourishing, and Jack's heart swelled with a deep sense of pride. This was the life he had always wanted, not the lavish lifestyle of the Hawthorns, but a simple, fulfilling existence that he had built with his own two hands. Word of Jack's success had spread throughout the town, and while some still doubted his unconventional journey, others were beginning to see the value in what he had created. Visitors came to learn from him, some out of curiosity, others for guidance. Jack wasn't an expert, but he was willing to share his knowledge, teaching others about the joys of living off the land, the power of hard work, and the importance of resilience. His ranch was more than just a place. It had become a symbol of determination and hope. Jack often thought back to that night when the Hawthorns had given him their so-called gift. At the time, he had felt humiliated, discarded like something no one wanted. But now, looking out at the life he had built, he realized that their joke had been the spark he needed. It had pushed him to dig deeper, to find strength he didn't know he had, and to turn a broken dream into a beautiful reality. Sitting on the porch, the breeze gently rustling the trees around him, Jack felt a peace he had never known before. His dream was no longer a distant hope. It was his, in every sense. The cabin was his home. The land was his. And above all, hope was by his side, a constant reminder of how far he had come. Jack had never needed the riches the Hawthorns had. He had everything he wanted now: the quiet strength of his work, the satisfaction of independence, and a life that was truly his own. As the years passed, Jack's ranch became more than just a place to live. It was a testament to his resilience. What had started as a cruel joke, a gift of brokenness and mockery, had evolved into a thriving farm, rich with life and purpose. The cabin, once abandoned and hopeless, now stood strong against the elements, a symbol of Jack's hard work and determination. The land, too, had been transformed, nurtured into something bountiful by his own hands. Though the Hawthorns had long since faded from Jack's daily life, their impact lingered. He often thought back to that fateful day when they had given him the so-called gift. At the time, it had been a cruel reminder of his place in their world. But now, looking at the life he had built, Jack realized that the joke had not been on him after all. It had been the spark he needed to ignite his true potential, to discover the strength within himself that he never knew existed. Jack had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. He had found peace. The quiet satisfaction of working the land, the joy of simple things, and the knowledge that his success was his alone. Sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Jack knew that this was his dream come true. Not the one the world had expected, but the one he had always longed for. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely at home.